In this lecture, I want to discuss Mary Cassatt, an American Impressionist who worked in Paris. I want to start actually by talking about an art historian named Linda Nochlin. In 1971, Linda Nochlin wrote a text that said, it actually asked the question, why have there been no great women artists? And she answered the question in her article by basically saying that women were denied more or less access to the artistic institutions that would train them to become great painters. I think that that is probably the biggest reason why there have been no famous painters who were extremely accomplished at that point in time by the time the Impressionists came around. But I also think that the question is a little bit more complex than that. Remember that we studied several female artists who were every bit as good as most men, Sophonie Anguissola and Artemisia Gentileschi and Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun. These painters all, even though they might not have had access to some of the schools, they were incredible talents and had a great amount of innate ability and were able to do a lot of really great things and further their career. I think that the reasons why they're not more famous is probably because men control most of the institutions and most of the places where art is sold and exchanged and things like that. Mary Cassatt is a great female artist who really did some incredible things with her career. She was the daughter of a Pittsburgh banker, and when she was a kid, she lived in Europe for about 5 years. And then she went on to study art. Privately, she was tutored for a while, and then she attended the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. At the age of 22, I think that's in 1866, she traveled to Europe to study with European painters. And in the process of going to Europe, she really got involved with the avant-garde there and primarily became very good friends with Edgar Degas. And he'll come up again later on as one of the people that we're going to talk about in comparison to her and her style. She's basically known for her subject matter that's very similar to a painter we studied before, Angelica Kauffmann, who was a neoclassical painter who, in her Cornelia, Mother of the Greci, Cornelia's Jewels, addressed the idea of motherhood as being the ultimate reward for basically being a female. And interestingly enough, Mary Cassatt never got married and never had children, but the majority of her work, or a good proportion of it at least, is devoted to genre scenes that depict mothers and children. And you can see here in this painting, she does it in a very frank way. There is a bit of sentiment in it, but I don't think that it's overly saccharine. I think that it's actually a very beautiful painting without being overly romanticized or overly sentimental. It's actually a captured moment. So this brings us to the idea of iconography and subject matter in terms of Impressionist painting. Impressionists often are described as being just basically eyeballs who are recording colored light. And I think that that's true in some ways, but I think that when we studied Degas and we studied Manet, these paintings, even though they're genre scenes and they're using things like landscape and figures and the ballet and stuff like that to as a point of departure for them to study color and to study texture and that kind of thing. I think that the paintings are still artifacts of the time and show, in some ways, the things that they valued. And in this instance, obviously, what could be more valuable than a beautiful child and a mother together? It's the future, if you think about it. A little bit of the Whitney Houston song here, right? So another thing about her formal ability is that she's working in a very similar style to Edgar Degas. She's using pastel on paper in a revolutionary way, the same way that Degas did, where she's putting down strokes of fairly intense or saturated colors and crisscrossing them in short sort of bursts and marks and allowing your eye to blend these things together. And that's about optical mixing. And she's also really playing with non-local colors. You can see some blues, grays, and purples in the faces. You can also see that, for instance, in the drapery, we have a sort of similar warm and cool relationship. So those things ally her or align her with the Impressionists, and she works in a very impressionistic style. I want to point out that, in my opinion, Mary Cassatt drew better than a lot of the Impressionists. You could probably debate this point, and it is open to debate, but I want to point out that her ability to capture anatomy and physical form is really very strong, and that she is quite a good draftsman, or draftswoman, I guess. Some of the things that Mary Cassatt did in terms of her documentation of the Parisian world of the late 19th century is very similar to what Edgar Degas did. And I think that she does share in some of the same sort of tastes and propensities that the Impressionists shared. So for instance, in my lecture on Paris in the 19th century and Baron Haussmann's reconstruction of Paris and Gustave Caillebott's painting, I specifically talked about Charles Garnier's Opera House and the rise of popular entertainment at that point in time, the ballet and the opera. And both of these artists are addressing a point of view of looking and being a voyeur, watching spectacles on the stage. And I think that that's an important element in both of these artists' work. I also made a point when I was discussing Edgar Degas that there were times when he worked with very local colors. And if you see in this painting on the right-hand side by Mary Cassatt, she is also working sometimes with more local colors. If you were to look a little closer at Mary Cassatt's painting, it shares something that is going on with Edgar Degas at the ballet. At the ballet, there's a woman who's holding opera glasses in that sort of claw-like hand that we see in the foreground. The woman in the right-hand image is also holding a pair of opera glasses. And if you look at the balcony behind her, there's actually a guy leaning over a banister who is using his opera glasses to look at her. And in this way, it sort of fits in with my idea of the voyeuristic quality of French 19th century culture. And I think that that kind of ties in with entertainment, with being seen at the opera house, and also with the idea of looking at women for visual pleasure. And so what I want to suggest also is that Mary Cassatt was aware of what art historians and also literary historians and English teachers often call the male gaze, G-A-Z-E, which is basically the male point of view of things. And I think even though Mary Cassatt was specifically painting a very feminine point of view, she was still under the greater umbrella of male culture, and she made paintings that would be acceptable to that society at that point in time. I think a really good example of what I was discussing of the male gaze is in Manet's Bar at the Folies Bergère. There's this idea of men looking at women and the idea of spectacle. Remember that I showed you in that lecture on Manet in the background there, there's actually an image of a person looking at the floor show using a pair of opera glasses. And opera glasses obviously will help you to see a little bit more closely. But the other thing about Manet's Bar at the Folies Bergère is this woman's look on her face as she's regarding the guy who's standing where we are as the viewer, and that's reflected in the mirror behind her on the right-hand side. So I think that a lot of the Impressionists, even though there's a voyeurism, there's also a very strong propensity towards looking at male and female relationships as women are the receivers of a male gaze, a male point of view, and that women need to basically present themselves to a male audience. And even the ballerinas and the dancers and the opera singers, that one of the qualities that a woman must have at this point in time to become truly popular in the arts is to be very beautiful. Mary Cassatt takes up the theme of a sort of world in which there's a point of view. And I think that she, in a subtle way, is able to circumnavigate and maybe even sort of thwart off a completely male point of view in terms of how she thinks about things. And this is a really good example of a bathing scene versus a bathing scene, the same way we looked at the two opera scenes, or the ballet and the opera. And what I want to kind of discuss with you is the idea that even though both of these painters, Degas and Cassatt, were primarily interested in issues that were formal concerns, non-local color, flattening out of forms. If you look at this painting, there's actually something that it really shares with Japanese printmaking, where it's really more of an immediate point of view where the patterns are flattening out, and it almost feels like one of those ukiyo prints from Japan. And the variety of patterns that we see here also relates in some ways to Manet's Olympia, because it's in the 19th century, the idea of printing textiles and wallpaper and materials is something that was really very popular, and they shared a lot of different patterns, and that's something that you see throughout Impressionist paintings, that often they really have a joy of painting patterns that Matisse later on takes up. That there's a view here of the bath, and one is an anonymous female getting into a bathtub. On the right-hand side, we have an up-close personal view of two human beings helping each other to bathe. It's not sexualized, it's more of a actual nurturing kind of thing that has to do with motherhood. And I think this ties in also with a story that I heard, and this may be an apocryphal story, meaning that if you want to use this story in, for instance, a paper or something, you need to make sure you find a source for it, because I'm not sure if it's actually completely accurate. But when I was in graduate school, one of the students who was working on a presentation about Mary Cassatt told a story, and the story goes something like this. One day, Mary Cassatt was talking with Edgar Degas at a social gathering, and Degas said to her, "Mary, when are you going to stop painting those Virgin Marys and their Christ-like children?" And I think that's a very insulting point of view, which kind of shows in some ways that there was still a hierarchy being established there, and that her paintings and her point of view of painting mothers and children was being dismissed in a way as being overly sentimental. I think this is actually not very sentimental. It's a very matter-of-fact point of view. Now, the other thing that I'm seeing in this painting is how she is thinking about environments around the figures as well, and how she's painting them. This is a genre scene of a home scene, which is a little bit less racy in some ways than the bathing scene on the left-hand side, which is clearly a sort of bedroom kind of scene. And I think if you really think about it, there's an overture to sort of sexual kind of content to it. Now, I need to point out that a lot of historians have tried to link Degas and Cassatt together as lovers. There is absolutely no evidence, and there's more evidence that they were not lovers and that they were just friends, and that both of them might have even been asexual and not gotten married. Now, there is another thing about Mary Cassatt's women and children and her point of view of children. And I think that she might have seen children as being this ultimate sort of angelic creature. And what I'm talking about specifically is there's another story, and again, you need to check the facts on this, the sources for it, to make sure that if you use it in a research paper or something like that, that it's accurate. But basically the story that I heard, again, in school was Mary Cassatt had a friend when Mary was in her old age, in her 70s or so, and she had been painting plein air out of doors for so long that she had developed really bad cataracts, and Monet has the same issue. So she was basically functionally blind, and this woman brought in her child, and the child sat down next to Cassatt, and Cassatt reached over and caressed the child's face and said, "I wish that I could see your face one more time so that I could paint you, you beautiful child," something to that effect. And I think that this is also part of her gestalt and part of her iconography. One of the other things that Mary Cassatt seems to document is the life and times of females. And this letter and the tradition of painting, drawing, and making prints of women sending letters has a long art historical precedent before this. Remember when we looked at Vermeer in particular, he has a whole series of genre scenes of women who are communicating with the outside world by writing letters, and that there's a tradition even in literature. For instance, Dangerous Liaisons is written in letter form, and that there are actually love poems and love letters that have been published throughout history. That's how women connect or communicate with the outside world. Another thing about this painting or this print, I'm sorry, is that the drawing in it is very accurate. And even though it takes a real page from Japanese printmaking, that it looks like one of those ukiyo prints where things are sort of flattened out and that the patterns become very important and become almost like a painter we're going to be studying later, Matisse, that the desktop that you're looking at is actually a sort of trapezoidal desktop, and it looks like the perspective is off on it, but that's actually one of those desks that would have had a sort of trapezoid top that would have come down. So the perspective in this would be actually accurate. I just wanted to point that out because sometimes people get a little bugged by it. The other thing I want to point out is that Mary Cassatt is doing this in etching and aquatint. Etching and colored aquatint. And we've studied printmaking, especially when we studied Hogarth and Durr, and then we talked about Goya using aquatint, and then Daumier with lithography. This is really a tough process because you have to align the plates really well, and she's making a colored etching with aquatint. And you just have to take my word on it that this is really a beautiful print and that the quality is really great, and that she absolutely mastered the technique of etching and aquatint and then was even able to include color with it. And so these prints take really about as much work as making a painting do because of the process and how many discards you have and that kind of thing. And I just wanted to show you one more print that has that same kind of quality and ends with the theme of Mary Cassatt and the mother and child and the maternal caress.